While NXT has generally been accepted to be the developmental league for WWE ever since its inception in 2010, there have been periods where it's felt more like a third brand than anything else. And because of that, on occasion, main roster performers have either moved back down there as an attempt to give the show a boost in star power, or alternatively, to pick up some new skills as a performer. But what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, so join us as we take a deep dive into back-to-school wrestlers who were sent back to NXT. And as always, if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with one of the biggest examples of this, perhaps the biggest in fact, because when Finn Balor returned to the black and gold brand in 2019, he wasn't just there to serve as a utility player. No, he was there to go all the way to the top for a second time. But then why wouldn't he? Because during his first run in NXT, the former Prince Devitt had pretty much been the #1 draw of the brand, with him having numerous classic matches there, all while holding on to their world title for a full 292 days. Then, once that was over, he hit the main roster and quickly made waves by becoming the inaugural Universal Champion too. That said, after a couple of years of poor booking following this, Balor's character was left badly in need of a refresh. Thank God this coincided with NXT's move to a 2-hour live show on Wednesday nights in mid-2019 then, and that was because, with the brand now going head-to-head with AEW Dynamite, he was able to serve as an excellent boost of star power down at Full Sail University, all while also reinventing himself by turning heel and dropping the demon aspect of his gimmick. Yes, now playing the role of the Prince, something a lot closer to the man he'd been in Japan when he created the Bullet Club, Balor rose high all over again. And that success was only further emphasized as he beat absolutely everyone in his path, including, but not limited to, Johnny Gargano, Matt Riddle, and Damian Priest, all before he finally dethroned Adam Cole to win the NXT World title for a second time. But this was more than him just reliving his past, of course. No, now with the star power of having been on the main roster boosting him, Finn was able to put on some of the best matches of his career, such as the pair of instant classics he had with Kyle O'Reilly in late 2010 and early 2021. Unsurprisingly then, many fans actually wanted him to stay there after a while, as they feared what would become of the former Universal Champion once he was back under the watchful eye of Vince McMahon. Luckily though, despite a few issues after first returning to SmackDown in 2021, Balor has been able to settle into a high-profile position once more as one of the key members of the Judgment Day. That said, without his second run on NXT giving him the opportunity to recreate himself, this may have never happened. And that's why multiple other stars have been only too happy to move back down to Florida as well in the time since, with one of the most prominent of these being Mandy Rose. Of course, by the time the Golden Goddess returned to the Developmental League in July of 2021, it was no longer in its more popular black and gold incarnation. No, after being moved over to Tuesday nights, NXT had been rebranded as 2.0, a far more gimmick-heavy affair. And this meant less of a focus on indie wrestlers and more of a focus on people who Vince McMahon would be likely to push on the main roster. So to set the tone for this then, at least as far as the women's division was concerned, Rose was brought in to teach the other young prospects the kind of things they'd need for their eventual time on Raw or SmackDown. That said, in order to best show them how it was done, she'd first have to win the brand's women's title from Raquel Gonzalez at that October's Halloween Havoc. Yes, it may not have been a decision more old-school NXT fans were happy about, as they remembered the days where the division was stacked with the likes of high-level workers such as the Four Horsewomen, Asuka, and Io Shirai. But even with this going against her, eventually Mandy was able to win most of them over, as with Gigi Dolan and Jacy Jayne by her side, she served as an effective mean girl final boss for the new era. Hell, at one point she'd actually improved to a level where she felt like a real champion, a level she'd never been able to reach on the main roster. And this led to fans wondering whether or not she wouldn't be positioned as more of a big-time player once she was finally moved back up to Raw or SmackDown down the line. After all, she wasn't exactly putting out 5-star classics, but her title defenses against Cora Jade, Roxanne Perez, Kaylee Ray, and Zoe Stark were all able to sell her as a real threat. It's just a shame we'd never see what came next then, because in December of 2022, she'd be released from her contract. And she wasn't the only figure from main roster WWE who went back down to developmental only to get let go before she could be called back up, because in 2021, the exact same thing happened to Ember Moon. But what happened here exactly? Well, after a fairly lackluster 3-year run on the main roster that saw her lose any momentum she'd built up during her prior time on the black and gold brand, the Texas native was sent back to Florida in September of 2020. And there, the hope was that, like with Finn Balor, not only would she be able to give the brand a boost during its ongoing head-to-head with AEW, but that she'd also be able to reinvent herself and find something which would work for her going forward. Sadly, though, this didn't prove to be as successful an endeavor for her as it did for the Irishman, because despite quickly aligning herself with Shotzi Blackheart, Moon failed to make much of a splash this time around. No, in spite of her skills, she'd somehow get lost in the shuffle. So much so that even when she and her partner briefly won the NXT Women's Tag Team titles on March 10, 2021, it felt like it was a win with little importance attached to it. Not that there weren't some positives of this time for her, however. After all, she did get to give Raquel Gonzalez a great world title defense at TakeOver In Your House later that year. But ultimately, it would be a case of too little too late, as in November of the same year, the former Athena was released from her contract, something which led to her jumping ship over to AEW, where she is currently the Ring of Honor Women's World Champion. And as it happens, she's not alone in such a career trajectory either, because the current ROH television champion is also a man who was sent back down to NXT for a period in 2021. Who are we talking about here? Why, Samoa Joe, of course. That's right, despite being one of the toughest men in the entire industry, Joe was struggling on the main roster come the turn of the decade on account of a bad concussion he picked up, making it hard for him to get in the ring anymore. So instead of doing what he did best and destroying everyone in his path then, he was mostly relegated to sitting at the commentary booth. But that wasn't ultimately what he wanted for himself long term, and so, when he was released from his contract in April 2021, he was initially happy to have the freedom to return to competition elsewhere. That said, while many questioned whether or not he'd go to either AEW or Japan at this point, in the end it proved to be neither of these as, after hearing about his firing, Triple H jumped at the chance to bring the Samoan submission machine back and have him serve as a key player in his NXT arsenal going forward. Unfortunately though, that's where it all got a bit weird, because with his head injury still being a lingering issue, it was unclear at first whether or not Joe would actually wrestle during this second run down in Florida. And even once this was clarified and he was cleared to fight Karrion Kross for the NXT World title, things continue to confuse, as after beating Kross to become a record 3-time world champion on the Developmental brand, the Orange County native was immediately forced to vacate and then was released from his contract once more. Yes, Samoa Joe can now hold the rare distinction of saying he's been fired from WWE twice in the same year. But while this did mean he'd be out of a job, it wouldn't be for long, because a few months later he'd show up in All Elite Wrestling, where he's since gone on to become a 2-time TNT champion and a 1-time ROH television champion. Of course, not everyone who returns to NXT has to go elsewhere to rebuild themselves after the fact, however. No, sometimes they're able to head back up to the main roster stronger than ever. And if you want any evidence of this being the case, you need look no further than Charlotte Flair's second spell there in 2020. But then we suppose calling this a full return to the black and gold brand would actually be disingenuous, as unlike others we've discussed today, the Queen never actually left Raw behind completely. No, instead, after winning the Women's Royal Rumble in January of that year and deciding she'd already won the Red and Blue brand's respective world titles enough times, Flair instead made the unusual decision to challenge for the NXT Women's strap instead. Why had she done such a thing? Well, in reality, it was to give the Developmental show another boost. In kayfabe, however, the situation appeared to be more to do with the fact that now feeling like she'd beaten everyone the big leagues had to offer, Flair wanted to take on the star of the future everyone was talking about in Rhea Ripley. And this led to the two fighting it out over the top women's prize in NXT during a match at that year's WrestleMania, a match which, following a hard-fought battle, the Queen would ultimately be able to win. So with her now becoming a 2-time NXT Women's Champion in the process, Flair split her duties between each show for a while going forward, something which served the dual purpose of both exposing the brand to a larger audience on Raw every week, all while also allowing her to work with people like Io Shirai on Wednesday nights. Needless to say then, this elevated Charlotte even further in management's eyes, as she was now seen as someone who could succeed in any role she was given. That said, given the fact her star power was needed full-time on Raw more than ever during the hellscape that was 2020, it meant her second run with the belt she'd helped to establish back in 2014 would be relatively short, as at TakeOver in Your House on June 7th of that year, she'd drop it to Shirai in a triple threat bout, which also included Rhea Ripley. Still, even if it was a short reign, the job had been done effectively. So effectively, in fact, that just 2 years later in 2022, when the NXT Tag Team division needed a boost, the exact same thing happened with the New Day. Well, it happened with two members of the New Day at least, because by this point, Big E was out with a serious neck injury. And so as a result of that, the only two active members of the stable left were Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods. Not that they would be slowed down by such a setback though. No, quite the opposite. Because feeling like they needed to do something to honor their injured partner during his time on the shelf, Kingston and Woods began setting their sights on winning tag team title gold once more. The only problem was, which belts would they go for? After all, using the Freebird rule, they'd already become 7-time SmackDown champions and 4-time Raw champions in the past. So really, even if they won one of these again, how much would it mean anymore? Yes, it was quite a conundrum, but thankfully the pair would come up with a solution when they realized there was still a set of belts they hadn't won. Belts which, if they were able to nab, would lead to them being recognized as Grand Slam champs in the division. That's right, as you've probably already figured out, in December of 2022, the New Day started appearing on NXT 2.0 and quickly made their intentions clear. Intentions which were to dethrone Pretty Deadly and, in the process, reach another level of history altogether. Of course, ever the fighting champions, Elton Prince and Kit Wilson accepted this challenge in short order. Though by the time Deadline came later that month, they probably wished they hadn't, as there, Kingston and Woods were able to do just what they said they would, and that was beat the incoming champs to take the belts home for themselves. And that wouldn't be the end of things either, because following on from this, the duo became a regular fixture on 2.0 for the next couple of months as they set up feuds against the likes of Chase University and Gallus. Unfortunately though, it would be the latter of these teams who ended up spoiling the positivity party, because on February 4th, 2023 at Vengeance Day, the Scotsmen were able to nab the belts in a fatal four-way match, formally ending the 56-day-long run of the main roster stars. But even if their run was over now, the New Day were able to keep strong, as with their job of elevating some up-and-coming talent now complete, they'd simply return to Raw and there continue to entertain crowds everywhere they went. When it comes to our next subject, however, he's yet to achieve the same results, as for the time being, he remains in developmental. That said, given how inexperienced Commander Aziz is, maybe this is for the best right now. Yes, Polish-born Babatunde Aigbusi did get some opportunity to shine on the red brand during 2020 when he became a key fixture of the short-lived Raw Underground segments, but really, while he showed some potential here, it was clear for anyone who was paying attention that he still had a long ways to go in order to be TV ready. And so perhaps that was why, after eating a pinfall loss to Braun Strowman on the September 21st episode of Raw that year, he'd disappear for the next 7 months, with him only returning at WrestleMania 37 to take up the role of Commander Aziz, a key general in the army of Apollo Crews. Sadly though, even this wouldn't work out in the long term, as by June of 2022, he'd be sent back down to NXT again when it became apparent his skills still hadn't progressed to the level required. But while this could have been seen as a major blow at first, it might still work out for the best in the long run, because since establishing himself on 2.0, Aziz has gone solo once more under the name of Daba Kato. And in this role, he's shown early signs that he might be headed in the right direction when it comes to getting main roster ready in full. The only question left then is, will he turn into the next Andre the Giant, or will he become the next Great Khali instead? We guess we'll just have to wait and see, just as we'll have to wait and see how his former on-screen boss, Apollo Crews, does following his recent return to the main roster after a second spell in NXT during 2022 himself. Of course, in the case of the former Uhaa Nation though, it couldn't exactly get any worse than his initial spell on Raw and SmackDown, because there he was treated like little more than a jobber at the best of times. Hell, even when he was given something to do in the form of a probably pretty racist Nigerian prince gimmick, he never felt like he was of any importance in the grand scheme of things. So perhaps it was a blessing in disguise then, when in June of 2022, he and his heavy Commander Aziz returned to the Developmental brand and there set their sights on domination, something Cruz in particular did by going after the brand's world champion at the time, Braun Breaker. Would he do a Finn Balor and win this one though? Well, no, but at least he'd help to elevate the son of Rick Steiner by giving him one of the best matches of his career. And he'd do the same thing for the likes of Solo Sikoa, Carmelo Hayes, and Grayson Waller over the weeks which followed as well, proving just how unappreciated he was as a wrestler on the main roster. That said, as of early 2023, Apollo's association with Aziz has come to a destructive end, and because of this, he's been forced to go it alone once more. Not that such a thing means he won't be able to succeed anymore, however. No, it's far more likely he'll just be stronger than ever going forward, now with the reinvigorated knowledge of just how talented he is when given the opportunity. He'll no doubt be giving it his all as he returns to Raw. Yes, as per the 2023 draft, Apollo Crews has been moved back up to the Red brand full-time, meaning he'll now be an exclusive fixture of Monday nights. And joining him there will be another performer who spent a period returning to NXT in order to get further seasoning. Who are we talking about this time? Why, Veer Mahan, of course. That's right. Well, we all had a good laugh at the Veer is Coming graphics, which aired endlessly on Raw during 2021 and 2022. The fact he never seemed to show up only blinded people to the reality that this was a performer who had a lot of potential to help WWE expand into the lucrative Indian market. After all, as a legit superstar in his home country, so much so that he even had a Disney-produced biography made about his life, Rinku Singh was exactly the kind of international name Vince McMahon was looking for. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that, as a former Major League Baseball player for the Pittsburgh Pirates, he also had a built-in audience in the US too. It's just a shame then that not long after debuting on NXT in January of 2018, he was fast-tracked to the main roster well before he was ready, meaning that there, alongside his Indus-Sher stablemates Shanky and Jinder Mahal, he'd struggle to make any kind of impact. Thankfully though, he was able to get a chance to recover from this, as following a very brief singles run on Raw in the spring of 2022, he'd be sent back down to Developmental, where he even began teasing a reunion with his former tag team partner Sangha. And while he didn't actually have many matches in NXT during his second run, the big man was at least able to make this union work when it eventually became official, just as he was also able to get Jinder back on board as well when they reformed on the Developmental brand, and from there set about taking over. Sure, in the end this takeover didn't exactly go as planned, as after failing to win the NXT World title from Braun Breaker, Mahal was forced to retreat and lick his wounds with his friends. That said, since this point, things have been going better for the trio, as in the 2023 draft, they were called back up to the main roster once more, a place where now that he's a little bit more experienced at playing his character, the hope is that Veer will finally thrive. Of course, as of the time of this video's recording, we've yet to see if such a reality will come to pass. But one thing we can be sure of is that with someone like our final subject of today, Tyler Breeze, now serving as a trainer at WWE's Performance Center, the Indian native will have every tool he needs at his disposal. After all, the reason Tyler got as good as he did was partially because of his own second run in the Black and Gold brand back in 2019, as there, both he and his tag team partner Fandango were able to escape jobberdom and become a star attraction on Wednesday nights for a while. Now, you could argue it should have never gotten to this point, as Breeze in particular was always one of WWE's most talented high-flying performers. That said, even if he had occasionally been amongst the top mix of the singles division during his first run on the Black and Gold brand, once he moved up to the main roster in 2016, any momentum he had quickly evaporated. So rather than serve as a demotion, when he was sent back to NXT towards the end of the decade then, it was the best thing which could have happened to the Canadian, and that was because now, rather than spending most of his time toiling away on C shows like Main Event, he could get to tear it up with teams such as Imperium or Legado del Fantasma. More so than that, in fact, because not only was Breeze now regularly being relied upon to deliver weekly bangers, he was also rewarded for his efforts when on August 26, 2020, he and Fandango defeated Fabian Eichner and Marcel Bartel to become the brand's tag team champions. Yes, after a decade with the company, Tyler was finally able to win some gold. And just to think, had he not returned to school, it's likely that never would have happened. But then each of the people we've discussed today could say something similar, as they all prove that sometimes going back to the minor leagues isn't a bad thing. No, sometimes it can be just what you need in order to give yourself that next big push forward.